a dream that one day this nation will rise up, live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal.
Pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe to assure the survival and the success of liberty.
The National Symposium on the Assassination of President John F. Kennedy and Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. proudly presents Harold Weisberg's lecture on the suppression of evidence in the assassination of John F. Kennedy.
Anyone who has a question could please use the behind the...
Thank you very much. Assassination, excuse me. Assassination, of course, is a political crime. However, it is a homicide. It has never been addressed officially as a homicide. And as some of you have heard me say before, if our president had been an unknown who died in a gutter, there would have been a proper homicide investigation, or at least enough of an investigation to determine if there'd been a homicide. When the president died, it did not happen. Now, in dealing with the suppressed evidence tonight, I'm going to be restricting myself, not entirely, but largely, to that evidence which is basic in a homicide investigation. Essentially, this is the medical evidence, and that includes the autopsy, and the president did not have a proper autopsy, as you will see. It includes the ballistics evidence and relevant scientific tests. I am hoping that although a House committee is not bound by the rules of evidence, it may yet be the first official investigation of any character to address what is the basic evidence in any homicide. Tonight you're going to see what the Warren Commission did not have, as well as what it did have and misused and thereby suppressed. I don't mean by that all of it. You will eventually be able to see all of it because it looks very much as though all of it's going to be here. I must have over 6,000 documents that were originally suppressed. They're largely FBI and CIA records, and to a fairly large degree, the staff memoranda of the Warren Commission. The once suppressed executive session transcripts of the Warren Commission make a stack close to 4 inches thick alone. So there is an enormous amount that was suppressed. I think, in fairness to the executive agencies, you should understand that the ultimate responsibility is that of the Warren Commission. It had limitless power. This power included that of subpoena. There is a special kind of subpoena known as a duces tecum subpoena, which means appear and bring with you. And on a duces tecum subpoena, you specify what you want the person subpoenaed to bring. There is virtually no record anywhere within the territorial limits of the United States that was immune. So whether or not the agencies of the executive branch functioned properly, and they did not, there is no way of escaping the responsibility of the Presidential Commission headed by the Chief Justice, because the ultimate responsibility rested with it. One of the ways in which the Commission suppressed evidence was just to avoid it. One of the ways of avoiding evidence was avoiding essential witnesses. The commission began with the preconception that there was a lone nut assassin. His name was Lee Harvey Oswald, and they cared about nothing else. The organization of their work in its earliest day, before they really began to function, was quite detailed. It's the first thing in the appendix of postmortem. And it is clear that the commission was determined to do what it could to lend credibility to their preconception of political nature that Oswald was the lone assassin. Recently, during the hearings of the Church Committee, some of the suppressed Department of Justice records were released, and we find there that the man who was then the Deputy Attorney General, Nicholas Katzenbach, and the Deputy Attorney General is actually the man in charge of the day-to-day operations of the Department of Justice, put it on paper that the primary, urgent, and immediate need was to do all that possibly could be done to assure the people that there was this lone nut assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald. Nothing else made any difference. It could not be more explicit in stating the official desire of the executive branch of the agency that there be no investigation. What I'm trying to tell you, and I hope you will believe, is that the Warren Commission did not investigate the assassination of John Kennedy, did not intend to, and was not intended to do that by the executive agencies of the government. Some of the suppressed evidence was subsequently made available, and I'm going to cite two examples of it. I'm not going to give you the illustrations now because I've reserved the visuals for the end, and there's a fair number of them. Both of these, interestingly enough, involve two men on the Warren Commission of its senior counsel, one who was the most conservative and one who was one of the two most liberal. These two together, David Bellin, who later ran the Rockefeller Commission and in between was head of lawyers for Nixon, and Joseph A. Ball, a liberal California attorney whose law partner is the father of an unsuccessful Democrat candidate for president, Jerry Brown. The father's name is Pat Brown, Edmund Pat Brown. He was a former governor of California. Their responsibilities included placing Oswald at the scene of two crimes. One, of course, was the assassination of President Kennedy, which was a murder, and the other was the killing of Officer J.D. Tippit, a Dallas police officer, who was killed at a time the commission failed to place simply because it investigated so diligently. Now, it could have placed it much more explicitly. It set the time at approximately 1:17 because the radio broadcast of the police department, that is dated, that's closest to it, and it's very close to it, is about 1:17. It also said, on the basis of no evidence at all, that Oswald had gone to his rooming house and left there at 1:03 p.m. The basis for saying that he left at 1:03 p.m. is that the woman who managed the rooming house said she saw Oswald leave while they were broadcasting about President Kennedy being killed. Most of you are not old enough to remember that period, but that was a limitation to more than 4 full days of TV. There was no way of placing the time at 1:03 p.m. that way. In addition to that, the commission ignored what this woman also said, that she saw Oswald standing in a bus stop waiting for a bus that went in the opposite direction from which the commission says Oswald walked to kill J.D. Tippit. Now, there's more to this story. I'll just tell you very briefly that if Oswald had caught that bus, and thanks to the diligence of the investigators, we don't know, it looped around and would have taken him directly to that movie theater in which he was later caught. There was a witness whose name is T.F. Bowley, and I reproduce the affidavit that he gave the Dallas Sheriff's Department in postmortem. He was driving to meet his wife after picking up his child at school. He drove past the scene of the crime after it had already been committed. He stopped and he said he looked at his watch, and his watch said 1:10 p.m. There is uncertainty about this because Mr. Bellin saw to it that T.F. Bowley was not a witness. That was Mr. Bellin's responsibility, that area of the work. I'm, of course, giving you his qualifications to run the Rockefeller Commission. Mr. Bellin and Mr. Ball and a cab driver about whom I have spoken earlier, as some of you may remember, William Whaley, and a few other people, reenacted Oswald's walk from his rooming house, this conjectured walk. Nobody knows if he walked it or not. This conjectured walk from the rooming house to where Officer J.D. Tippit was killed. And Mr. Bellin is a diligent lawyer. He crosses T's and dots I's. Therefore, none of the people who enacted the walk officially were called as witnesses. Instead, while Mr. Ball was questioning cab driver Whaley, he said, "Did you go on a walk with us?" And Whaley said, "Yes." "And did we time it?" And Whaley said, "Yes." "And was that time 18 minutes? And Whaley said, "Yes, sir, it was 18 minutes. Now let's do some simple arithmetic, because it turns out that the executive branch and its presidential commissions really can't do arithmetic, at least not while they have their shoes on. Because we have to add together the 3 for the 3 minutes after 1, at which the commission says Oswald left his rooming house, and the 18 for the 18 minutes that it took the staff, counsel, and Whaley and others to execute the same walk. Now, my reference to the shoes is to the fact that if you add 3 and 18, you exceed the number of digits and toes you have by 1. It comes to 21 minutes after 1, or almost 5 minutes after the police broadcast the fact of the J.D. Tippit murder, and of course they didn't broadcast it in advance of the murder. This is one aspect of suppression. Now, let me now go to the killing of President Kennedy. The commission says that Oswald was lurking in a 6th-floor sniper's nest, all ready to kill President Kennedy and to have his rendezvous with destiny. This is nonsense. It is totally without support, but I won't go into that now. There was a witness, Mrs. Carolyn Arnold, who was an employee of the school book depository, and she knew Lee Harvey Oswald. She was interviewed by the FBI, but not until December 15th, which was a little bit more than 3 weeks after the crime. And the FBI report says, and I reproduce this in facsimile in the appendix to Photographic Whitewash, the 3rd of the Whitewash series. According to the FBI, Mrs. Arnold said that at about 15 minutes after 1, as she was leaving the building, she saw Lee Harvey Oswald standing on the 1st floor, not the 6th floor, the 1st floor. There was a problem with that. It was false. That's not an uncommon problem, nor was the source of the falsehood uncommon. It was the FBI. We know it's false by an accident, not by Mr. Ball's diligence in producing Mrs. Arnold to testify. Several months later, the Warren Commission asked the FBI to ask 6 simple questions of all the employees of the school book depository building. Did they see the president's motorcade, where were they, that kind of thing. So the FBI went, and it did not trust Mrs. Arnold to write out her own statement. It wrote out the statement for her. And naturally, it made mistakes in the statement. This was easy to do because Mrs. Arnold was right there talking to the FBI agent. But Mrs. Arnold was one of those people who did not want mistakes in her statement, so she corrected it in her own handwriting. Now, of course, the FBI didn't want to overburden the Warren Commission with the irrelevant. It did not consider an analysis of the hairs on what was known to be Lee Harvey Oswald's blanket as irrelevant, but it did consider someone who gave exculpatory testimony as irrelevant, so it didn't bother to give the Warren Commission Mrs. Arnold's handwritten statement. Instead, it gave her a retyped statement prepared by the FBI. They did that in a number of cases, and that's the only reason it was possible for the Warren Commission to call a policeman, Marion Baker, as a witness, because he gave 6 different versions of one thing. What Mrs. Arnold actually said is that she left the building at 12:25, not 12:15. The FBI sometimes is careless with digits. And that she saw Lee Harvey Oswald standing on the first floor. Now, this, of course, was totally exculpatory, and I'll explain to you why. The commission story is that Oswald's rifle was disassembled. It admits that Oswald was never seen doing any shooting, and it doesn't even pretend that Oswald was an expert on reassembling rifles. Oswald was dead, so it had to get somebody else. It got an experienced FBI firearms man, and it took him 6 minutes to reassemble the rifle. That's 1 minute more than Oswald had. In addition to all of this, Oswald had to go to the far back of this good-sized building, go up 6 flights of steps, then go all the way to the front and to the opposite corner, then get his rifle out of his alleged hiding place, and only then put it together, and only then load it. It is obvious from this suppressed evidence, and this suppressed evidence alone, that if it is true, and there's no reason to believe it's not true, it was physically impossible for Lee Harvey Oswald to have fired a shot at anybody, and I think you will have no trouble agreeing with me that when we had a presidential commission, these things certainly should have been resolved. Testimony certainly should have been taken from these witnesses. So here you have several kinds of suppression of evidence and essential evidence. In order to understand more fully not what happened, but the official story, I'm going to read you the Warren Commission's conclusions about the shooting, because as we discussed earlier, it was a gunshot by homicide, and the most basic evidence of all relates to the shooting and its consequences. This is from page 19, I've typed it over, of the Warren Commission report. I'm reading a direct quotation, and when I read numbers, these numbers are in parentheses. The president was first struck by a bullet which entered the back of his neck and exited through the lower front portion of his neck, causing a wound which would not necessarily have been lethal. The president was struck a second time by a bullet which entered the right rear portion of his head, causing a massive and fatal wound. Now, I'm going to stop quoting to illustrate this for you. The commission story is that the president was first struck at about this point, that the bullet went on a downward trajectory and exited at precisely this point on nicking this part of the president's tie and making a bullet hole through the overlapped tabs of the shirt. The commission's account of the head shot, which had caused the fatal shot, and it says there was only one, is that it struck at the occiput. That's the bony protuberance at the back of your head. Right here, just a little bit to the right of center, right here. In this summary, it does not describe where the massive wound was, and it didn't mean there was only one wound, although it said causing a massive fatal wound. There was a wound of entrance and a wound of exit. That was in an area extending upward and a little bit to the rear of the right ear, going not quite to the midline of the head, coming down right over the right temple and going back, all in all, an area of about 5 inches in length of the right side, and the right side only of the president's head. That's the official story. 2, Governor Conley was struck by a second bullet, which entered on the right side of his back and traveled downward the right side of his chest, exiting below his right nipple. This bullet passed through his wrist and entered his left thigh, where it caused a superficial wound. I'll show you that. It entered here at about the level of the 5th rib and underneath the armpit. It supposedly came out here. It then struck his wrist about here, it says, and came out about here. Then it went through the air and hit him as I'll move and show you. I bent my knee in showing that to give you an idea of its proximity to the knee. Three, although it is not necessary to any essential findings of the Commission to determine just which shot hit Governor Conley, and I'm stopping a direct quotation there, as you will see, nothing could be more essential. This does not account for another shot. This is an account restricted to the shots that struck the 2 men. There was a bystander, whose name you will hear again. It's James T. Tegg, T-A-G-U-E. He was standing at the diametrically opposite extreme of Dealey Plaza. A bullet hit concrete of a curbstone. The spray wounded Bowie in the cheek. It was a superficial minor wound, but the poor man did bleed. So far as J. Edgar Hoover is concerned, he bled in vain, because J. Edgar Hoover provided the first definitive report to the Warren Commission. It has the number 1 in the Warren Commission's files. It's quite elaborate. It has 5 volumes, 4 volumes, I think 6 volumes. It's either 5 or 6, I've forgotten now. 1 volume of text and all the rest of appendixes. And with all this wordage, Mr. Hoover did not report that Mr. Tegg was wounded. I'm glad that doesn't surprise you, because that's not all he didn't report. And of course, the Commission also didn't report to the people what he didn't report. Mr. Hoover described the assassination of a president without even referring to all of his wounds. Now, this isn't the FBI you've seen on television, but it is the FBI when a president gets killed. So you have the shot that caused the wounding of Tegg to account for. You have 2 non-fatal wounds on the president to account for. You have 5 non-fatal wounds on Governor Conley to account for. You have a hole in the back of the president's head and an enormous fault in the top of his head to account for. And according to the Warren Commission, this great load has to be carried by 3 bullets, each of which had a diameter of not much more than 1/4 of an inch. Allegedly a 6.5 military type Mannlicher Carcano bullet. No place in the Warren report, no place in the 26 volumes, no place in the Warren Commission's files will you find the results or the worksheets or any raw material or anything of meaning relating to the most important of the scientific tests that are normal with everybody except popular presidents, and a gunshot homicide where the case isn't automatically solved. One of these is a spectrographic analysis. Incredible as it may seem, the Warren Commission didn't have it. The agent who performed it was the last witness before the Warren Commission. It was 9 days before the 900-page report was rolling on the presses. The report, of course, had already been written and was on the presses, and he was not asked about the results of his scientific tests. These, I would assure you, are not oversights. Most of the Warren Commission lawyers had prosecuting experience, including the Chief Justice, who had been a prosecutor in his earlier day. The stories I've heard in California is that the murder of his own father is unsolved. All the members of the Warren Commission lawyers, including our present president, all the other members of the Warren Commission are lawyers, including Mr. Ford. Some of them were well-known lawyers. Allen Dulles was a member of the Warren Commission, and he was the head of the CIA. There were many other lawyers on the staff of the Warren Commission. I don't have to tell you how many lawyers there are in the Department of Justice. And not one of these lawyers ever thought to see to it that when our president was killed, these tests were in the hands of the Presidential Commission that was to investigate. You're going to see a few papers that have been suppressed on this tonight. I want you to understand my belief. My belief is that nobody wanted anybody to see these tests, because these tests, no matter how meagerly done, no matter how improperly, showed that the official story that had been predetermined was false. The only reason we know as much as we do now is because I am blessed with a friend who is a good lawyer, Jim Lassar, and we keep filing lawsuits. We have filed 9. We have 3 current right now. One of these began with my request of J. Edgar Hoover of May 23, 1966, for the spectrographic analysis results. We filed a suit on that in 1970, and it was a lot of work. We were in federal court 3 times, district level, 3 times appeals level, Supreme Court of the United States. Congress finally amended the law and in effect said to the FBI, you've got to make this available. That was in 1974. Mr. Ford vetoed that amendment, those amendments. The Senate and House overrode his veto. The law has been effective for 1.5 years. This was the first suit filed under the amended law. The law says they must perform in 10 days, so I don't have the results. The conclusions of the Warren Commission, as you will see, are simply not tenable. They are not supported by evidence, and they were never supported by evidence. And I explained what I think by now is obvious, so you can understand this meant that evidence had to be suppressed. I've told you the story of the shooting as officially recounted. It's not from Alice in Wonderland. I want to talk to you now about the non-fatal bullet. You're going to see a picture of it, several. This bullet, a little bit over 1 inch long and almost invisibly larger than 1/4 inch in diameter. Not a high-velocity bullet, as it is often referred to, but a medium-velocity bullet with a muzzle velocity of not much over 2,000 feet a second. If any of you hunt, you know that's not a high-velocity bullet. I'm not saying that bullets aren't fatal. A very small .22 can kill. But I am saying that this bullet was exaggerated about and can't bear the weight of evidence attributed to it. Bullet 399, that's its Warren Commission exhibit number. Even if it did not strike bone in the president's neck, did smash 4 inches of a very hard rib bone in Governor Connolly's body, It not only smashed his right wrist, it went through it, smashing all the way, and it then did some damage to his thigh. And from this spectacular career that nobody in the world was ever able to duplicate, ranging from CBS and the white laboratories they hired for this purpose to the Army's Edgewood Arsenal, nobody could ever duplicate this. This bullet emerged unscathed. There is not so much as a scratch on it. At that time, the FBI's ballistics expert was an agent named Robert Fraser. He is no longer, because Mr. Fraser is one of 4 FBI agents involved in this case who took a retirement at an age earlier than mine as soon as we went through the motions of filing this suit, and then after we filed it, 2 on identically the same day, which happened to be the day after a false letter was written for Director Kelly's signature, and he signed it. Robert Fraser did testify before the Warren Commission, and he said of bullet 399 that if it had struck coarse cloth or leather, there would have been markings left that he would have detected, and he detected no markings. Now, there's much magic that has been attributed to this bullet, but imagine bone not being able to do to it what coarse cloth or leather would do to it. Mr. Fraser received the bullet when it reached the FBI laboratories by which he was employed, and he removed samples for these tests. He testified, however, only before the Warren Commission, he testified only to taking off 1 sample. Now, let me explain this to you. I describe this as a military bullet. That means it has a hardened jacket or outside covering, because the concept of humanitarian warfare is to make a through and through wound and not to kill if possible. For this purpose, lead is not adequate because lead's very soft. Bullets have cores of lead. They have jackets of hardened material. In this case, it was a copper alloy. And Special Agent Fraser told the Warren Commission in some detail just how he got out a sharp little old knife and cut himself a little piece out of the nose, you're going to see it, of bullet 399, and gave it to others in the FBI lab, and they I started to say committed. They performed spectroscopy. However, most of the bullet was lead. Mr. Fraser didn't testify to removing a lead sample. The Warren Commission lawyers didn't ask him about removing a lead sample. And nobody ever thought to ask, how could they test the lead alloy without a sample? Well, it was in my mind for many years, and when Mr. Fraser was called upon to testify in the Whirlings, I asked the lawyer who was going to examine him, who I knew, to ask him straightforwardly, had he removed a sample of lead? Alvin Noetzer, who was later a judge, did that, and Mr. Fraser answered straightforwardly, yes, he had removed a sample of lead. I want you to bear in mind that he was a witness in the investigation of the assassination of our president, which is as serious a crime as there can be in this country, that he was an FBI agent. He carried the additional obligation of being an expert witness. He was a witness before a presidential commission, and nobody on that presidential commission asked him this very obvious question, essential in any investigation. There are no references in the Warren report to a finer test. I mean by that, a much more sensitive test, a test that can give you analyses in parts per billion. Can you conceive of that fineness, parts per billion? It's neutron activation analysis, and we're in court on that now. And the defenses that have been advanced to this point boil down to, well, the FBI just didn't do its job. It was a president's murder, remember, but the FBI didn't do its job. We are told that certain tests that should have been done by neutron activation analysis were not made. I want to give you an example of what this can mean to try and put it in the context. There's an enormity to the subject matter, and one always has to wonder, should I explain this or isn't it necessary? There were 5 fragments of bullet found in the presidential limousine, 3 in the back seat, 2 in the front seat. The 2 they weren't all found at one time. That's because the FBI gave the car a thorough searching. And that's because it was after the Secret Service had already searched it. The 2 larger fragments, and with the bullet itself as small as I've told you, you can imagine that they weren't very large, were found in the front seat. And then hours later, the FBI decided to go back again, and although they had searched the car so very thoroughly, you know how thorough the FBI can be, they neglected to look underneath the seat in which Mrs. Conley had been sitting. So when they looked under where Mrs. Conley had been seated, they found 3 more fragments. So they also had some fragments recovered from the bodies of the 2 victims, Governor Conley and President Kennedy. The bullet, or a fragment of bullets, allegedly struck the windshield of the car, you may remember. And then I've told you about the wasted blood of James T. Tegg and the concrete that was struck by that bullet. The trim of the windshield of the car was dented. And I think from this you begin to get an idea that there were lots of samples for testing. Well, there were more. The bullet supposedly went through President Kennedy's tie and the front of the shirt. It surely went through the back of his shirt, the commission says so. And it went through the back of his jacket. Traces are left by bullets that do that. Spectroscopy is fine to parts per million, sometimes more. Neutron activation to parts per billion. And there was no testing by neutron activation analysis of the clothing. There are no definitive reports, no stated conclusions, no tabulations in the form of final reports of the spectroscopy either. I don't mean only that the Warren Commission didn't have them. I mean that the FBI is in court when all they got to do is dish this out and the case is over, and they haven't done it in more than 10 years. So we'll go back to these fragments of bullet found in the car. One of the 2 fragments in the front seat consisted entirely of a piece of the copper alloy jacket. The other of these 2 larger front seat fragments had both a piece of lead alloy core and a piece of copper alloy jacket. Now, I think you can understand that if each of these 5 fragments did not come from one bullet, and when, as happened, the Warren Commission said all of these fragments came from the shot that exploded in the president's head, it was important in terms of establishing fact to perform the tests that could prove whether or not all of these fragments could have had a common origin. Is that clear to you, as I hope it is? Well, I'll explain a little bit more about these tests. When the alloys are mixed, the mixing of the lead core alloy is not nearly as careful as that of the copper jacket alloy. So, among the tests, the FBI assures us under oath and in court that were never made when our president was killed is any at all on the piece of copper from the front seat of the president's car. But then they also tell us that they didn't do it with a windshield, and they didn't do it with the president's clothing. Regretfully, the Warren Commission did not tell us that, and it's particularly regretful because if they had, they couldn't have foisted off a false account of how our president was killed. There is more, of course, to the ballistics evidence. All I'm trying to do is to give you an understanding, basic to an understanding of what evidence was suppressed, and so you can reach your own conclusions independent of mine as to why it was suppressed. I'll try and draw the picture together again a little bit more. I've already gone through the 5 fragments from the car, remember, and the windshield. The one bullet, number 399, has to be the only source, according to the official story, of any damage to President Kennedy's clothing or to Governor Connolly's clothing, and to account for any and all fragments removed from the torsos of the victims. I think you can understand it. That's why it's called the magic bullet. Governor Connolly's clothing presented more of a problem because the FBI stayed away from it until Mrs. Connolly got discouraged and washed it. There then is what could be done with scientific testing of the curbstone, because you see in this reconstruction, when the commission said 3 shots were fired, and in the time permitted, nobody in the world was able to do it, and Oswald was really a lousy shot, so he had less chance. One bullet, the magic bullet, caused all 7 non-fatal injuries. Second bullet, the one that missed and hit the concrete and caused James Tague to bleed, is the second bullet. One bullet only hit the president ahead and exploded. These are the 3 bullets the commission allows. The reality is that if Oswald had to fire 3 bullets with that rifle, he couldn't have done it. But this is the official story. And this is why tests are performed in courts of law. These tests could prove whether or not all of this was possible. The other important part of the evidence is medical evidence. Now, the president was killed in Dallas. The only law violated was Texas law. Texas law required an immediate autopsy. The medical examiner, Dr. Earl Rose, went there to perform the autopsy. The Secret Service literally kidnapped the president's body and took it to Washington on Air Force One. On the way to Washington, it was decided that because the president had been a Navy man in World War II, there would be an autopsy at the Navy Medical Center in Bethesda, Maryland. It's a prestigious medical institution. Unfortunately, it doesn't have any forensic pathologists on its staff. It's pathologists or laboratory men who know nothing about homicide by gunshot. The president's body reached the Navy hospital at about 7:30. A series of x-rays and pictures were taken. His body was then taken into the autopsy room, and what was totally unknown until I published post-mortem, the Navy then posted a military guard around the autopsy room, ejected every civilian, and thereafter, during the course of the autopsy, did not let a civilian enter. The autopsy was kept secret throughout all of the life of the Warren Commission, throughout all of the testimony of the Warren Commission, and suppression of evidence includes suppressing all of the testimony until the report was issued, and then waiting until 2 months later to release all of it at one time when nobody could possibly comprehend it. All of this was in secrecy, and all of this was suppression. I have given you an account of the shooting that the commission accepted from the president's autopsy. If that corpse had not been kidnapped, there would have been a proper autopsy in Dallas. And there is no question now, even the Commission's defenders admit that the President did not receive a proper autopsy. You will see, as a matter of fact, that the Commission did not even locate the President's wounds accurately, and that the doctors who testified to the President's wounds locations testified falsely. Given the materiality of that evidence and the first-person knowledge of these doctors, I believe it was perjury. And that is a felony, and a very serious one, and a much more serious one in this case. Before I go to the pictures I have to show you, which deals with evidence, I'd like to ask if there's any uncertainty about these basic evidentiary needs in the investigation of the murder of the President that I haven't made clear, having to do with the ballistics or the medical evidence. Well, if not, I will proceed. I'm going to tell you first how I obtained what you're going to see. I've saved all of these to show at one time out of consideration for the TV crew, yourself, and selfishness. I can't stand for too long, and as you saw, the microphones fed back when I started to walk. I'm in a post-libitic condition, and I will be sitting down while you see the slides and explaining them to you. All of the essential medical evidence, except for the autopsy, and except for an unoriginal copy of the autopsy, were suppressed until Congress did this wonderful thing and passed the Freedom of Information law. Now, I'm not David against Goliath. I'm one American. And I've been using the law. And it'd make me very happy if some of you would use the law for whatever purposes you want, because it isn't a glorious American tradition. And laws are like muscles, as some of you have heard me say. They have to be used or they atrophy. You are going to see what the Warren Commission did not have and did not want: a death certificate. There is no homicide investigation that must not begin with the official cause of death, unless you're a popular president of the United States, and unless the investigating body is a presidential commission. Now, if I could get it, you know very well they could get it. You are going to see the originals of some of the autopsy, the handwritten protocol, 17 pages long. There's some sketches attached. You're going to see some letters relating to it, and these are the official copies that were those of the President's own physician, Navy Admiral George G. Berkeley. The Warren Commission did not have those. And I presume by now you're not easily surprised, so I have no reluctance in telling you they also did not call the President's own physician as a witness. He is the one doctor in the world, of all the many doctors, who was in the motorcade with the President, who was in the emergency room at Parkland Hospital when the emergency measures were taken in what was known would be a futile effort to restore the President's life. He was instantly dead. And then was in the Bethesda Navy Hospital. This disqualified him as a Warren Commission witness. And as a matter of fact, I don't remember any significant FBI report of an interview with him either. Then you're going to see some pictures that were taken by the FBI and not given to the Warren Commission, and I got them under the Freedom of Information law. You're going to see some Warren Commission pictures that are not as clear as they could be, this being the arcane FBI science when they want to suppress evidence, and other things of this sort, including some FBI handwritten laboratory notes that I got under the law, and some pictures that were taken at the time of the crime, and some pictures that were taken for me. The sketch at the left represents the bullet going in where I showed you on my body, in the back of the President and coming out in the front. The sketch at the right, and I'll put down the microphone to show you this in a minute, shows a hole where the bullet is supposed to have gone into the president's head in the back, and where it is supposed to have caused the fault on the top. That shows the skeleton. The top line goes to the... Can you steady it, George? The top line shows the location of what is known as the mastoid process, and if you feel the knob just a little bit behind and under your ear, that's where the mastoid is. The diagonal angle is labeled third thoracic vertebra. You know about the vertebra? Those are below the knob on the back of your neck. If you want to feel it on your body, count 3 knobs down, and that's the third thoracic vertebra. The next typing and the next horizontal line is labeled acromion process. This is an exhibit I made up. And it goes to the shoulder joint, which is known as the acromion process. Then below that, gone to the flat bone that you can see, the shoulder blade, which is known as the scapula. Well, the reason I've done this is because the Warren Commission says that the measurements made by the doctors, and in fact the autopsy doctors say they measured from the mastoid process and the acromion process. Now, I think you all understand that if you move your head, you move the mastoid process, and therefore there was no fixed point for measurement. Do I have ready agreement to that, as I hope? And if you move your shoulder, the same thing is true, isn't it? So when the doctors at Bethesda decided to perform an autopsy on the president, instead of using the spine, which is the normal measurement, it goes through everybody's body and doesn't move once it gets there. When you measure, each bone is in a fixed place and in a fixed relationship. They didn't use that. They used what will move. Now, there was a death certificate. I don't know how well you're going to be able to read it, but will you try the next slide, George? No, skip. Now that shows you a body chart. And if you look on the right-hand side, you'll see what the body chart made at the autopsy bench actually shows. Can you see the line and the 7x4 and the black spot a little bit to the right of the midline of the president's body below the collar? Is that black spot visible? Well, that's where the worksheets of the autopsy doctors placed the so-called non-fatal shot. Now, George, can you raise it just a little bit? If these are out of order, I think we better proceed this way and hope we can make sense out of it. That's good. You see the writing in the lower left-hand corner? That says, verified, G. Berkeley. In short, the president's doctor says that the president was not shot in the neck. He was shot in the back 6 inches below the neck. And, of course, he was not a Warren Commission witness. Go ahead, George. Don't worry if they're out of order. That is the first page of the death certificate the Warren Commission didn't have, and my only purpose in having it there is so that you can see it as that of the president with the address at the White House. And now let's go to the next one, George. Can you come down a little bit? Whoa, that's fine. If you can't read that, Admiral Berkeley, and I have all copies of this, including the handwritten copy, written on pink paper, let me tell you, in this case, it says that the president was shot at the third thoracic vertebra. Now you know why I had third thoracic vertebra on that chart. Not in the neck, but in the third thoracic vertebra. That exactly coincides with the spot on the body chart where the doctors in Bethesda, while they were examining the president's body, and those blotches you saw were the president's vital fluids, they coincide exactly. Let's go to the next one, George. Now, this reads, I, James J. Humes, Dr. Humes, then a commander, was in charge, the chief pathologist at the Navy Hospital in Bethesda. You see the letterhead of the U.S. Naval Medical School. He was in that part of it. I, James J. Humes, certify that I have destroyed by burning certain preliminary rough draft notes relating to Naval Medical School Autopsy Report A63272 and have officially transmitted all other papers related to this report to higher authority. If anybody can think of anything more Byzantine than the destruction by burning of any records relating to a president's autopsy, I'd like to hear it loud and clear. There may be one exception, and if you read the bottom, it is the acceptance and approval by the president's own physician. And while you're considering exceptions, you might want to consider that the Presidential Commission did not have this, did not want it, and did not care about it. The next one, please, George. That's out of order, but let me tell you what it is right now. That is a threat given to so many people, it was executed in blank. For years, the government swore this did not exist, and I finally forced them to give it to me. Dr. J.H. Stover was the immediate commanding officer of that hospital, and all the civilians had been put out of the room and kept out of the room. This was given with a name filled in to every naval person there, and if you read it carefully, it says, if you open your mouth, you're going to be court-martialed. I'll explain to you that what Dr. Humes swore he burned is the first draft of the autopsy. His notes have disappeared. Whether he burned them or not, we don't know. But he did swear that he burned the first draft of the autopsy, that this is the second draft. He burned the first draft most appropriately in the fireplace of his recreation room. He had all these records home from the hospital. These corrections, he says, were made when he took this to the Navy hospital. And then the commanding officer of the whole installation, Admiral Galloway, and others were there, and they made changes. The time at which this autopsy was rewritten should interest you. It was after Lee Harvey Oswald was killed by Jack Ruby, and everybody knew that there was not going to be any trial of Lee Harvey Oswald, and therefore there would be no cross-examination of any evidence because there'd be no trial in which you could be cross-examined. Think about this, people. That's the history of the drafts of the autopsy. This was later retyped, later that night. Next one, George, please. You can't read this too well, but there are two of these, and I'm going to explain it to you. There was, after the Warren Report and after my first book and others created an awful lot of dissension in the country, the Attorney General of the United States appointed a panel of authentic forensic experts, one of whom was a radiologist, to go over the autopsy material that the Warren Commission did not have, particularly the pictures and x-rays taken during the autopsy. They issued a report that was suppressed until it was forced out in court. They said of the supposed non-fatal wound that the president had, where the autopsy doctors had sworn that they read the x-rays and sworn that the x-rays showed no metal in the area of the president's neck, that there was metal there. The same legal proceeding forced out a subsequent written statement by these autopsy doctors where they practiced a little bit of semantics, and instead of saying that there was no metal there, they said there was no whole bullet and no major part of a bullet. And of course there was nobody to ask them how many minor parts. But remember, they had also sworn that there were no fragments there. The other page, if you'll move it, George, refers to the wound of the president's head. And instead of saying that the president was wounded at the occiput. They said he was wounded, the so-called wound of entry was 100 millimeters above the occiput. Try the next page, George. What they are saying is 4 inches higher. Now, go back to the part that Dr. Humes changed and ask yourself how you can get tangential to the scalp with a shot hitting the back of the head. You can't, can you? But you certainly can with a shot going 4 inches higher at the top of the head. Now, this was suppressed. It existed. It is based on evidence that was suppressed and did exist and exists today. And that, of course, is what we're talking about tonight in a limited sense, not nearly all of it, what was suppressed. The question is that with all the suppression of evidence, do I believe that the Warren Commission can be behind it? The answer is no, and I will explain that in more detail. I not only do not think that the Warren Commission killed the president, I don't believe the FBI or the CIA did. I spend an awful lot of time on this, and I have seen no evidence that justifies any such belief. However, on the suppression of evidence, they are all responsible. Another question? Don't be afraid to walk up. Thank you.
If Lee Harvey Oswald didn't have enough time to make the shot out of the 6th floor, do you believe that somebody else was on the 6th floor, or where else did the shots come from?
The question is, if Oswald didn't have enough time to make the shot, did someone else do it, or where else did the shots come from? I don't believe any shot came from that 6th floor window. I don't know, because the investigation was of such a nature that we can't know. But the evidence, and especially that evidence I've been showing you tonight, leads me to believe that no shot came from the 6th floor window. It's not impossible. Where else did the shots come from? Again, I can only tell you generally, but I have no doubt that the president was shot from both the front and the back. Actually, of course, the front is 180 degrees in one direction, and the back is 180 degrees in another direction. But there is no reasonable doubt that the president was shot in the front, above the collar, above the tie, that he was shot in the back, 6 inches down on the back, on the top of the head, and a case can be made out on the evidence I did not go into, suppressed by the Warren Commission, but quite explicit in the Department of Justice suppressed report pages of which you showed, a shot to the front of the head. It's not certain. The evidence indicates it happened, and with a bullet with a very soft core. Now, I want to add a little bit, because I was thrown off a little bit, as you were, by the slides having fallen down and being out of order, and I'm sorry I didn't see to it that they were put back in the right order. All the doctors who saw the president in the emergency room in Dallas said that this shot was an entrance wound or from the front. The story was then turned around by the federal government, not those doctors. They were leaned on heavily. So I hope that's an answer to the gentleman's question. Another question?
As you said that the doctors were leaned on, have you been leaned on at all?
No, not the way. The question is, since the doctors have been leaned on, have I been leaned on? The only thing that's leaned on me is nature with this thrombosis. Really, no. And in case you're interested, as most people are, have I been threatened? Yes. Does it make a difference? No. The leaning that I'm worried about now is the awful power of the government and its contempt for any concern about the use of that raw power. They're wasting an enormous amount of time for me in court to prevent my bringing out more of the kind of evidence you've seen tonight. They lean on me that way, but that's all. Another question? While this question is coming up, I'd like to remind you people of what most of you are too young to remember. A statement Franklin Delano Roosevelt made to us in the depths of a terrible time, the Great Depression. He said, "We have nothing to fear but fear itself." Fear is a corrosive thing. You instill terror into yourself if you will permit yourself to be afraid, and you will cripple whatever you might want to do. Yes.
It's kind of a complex, but this summer.
Louder.
Okay, this summer I'm from Milwaukee, and Ralph Adams' Fine Show, The Fine Point, they had a UWSP professor who has, done a lot of research on this, and he had the Zapruder film. He said that several frames had been cut out. He said that I observed, at least in the film, that when the wound to
May I repeat this part first? The lady is referring to an appearance with the Zapruder film on the Ralph Adams Fine Show in Milwaukee I take it by Professor Rohn, who showed the Zapruder film and said frames were missing. Is that all?
Is that true?
Absolutely. Again, as you go out, you don't have to buy the books to look at them. If you'll open to the appendix of the book with the blue cover, whitewash, which dates to February 15th, 1965, that's more than 11 years ago, I reproduce one page of the 26 volumes of the Warren Report. This is supposed to be a seriatim reproduction of the individual frames of the Zapruder film. Now, motion picture is a series of still pictures that seem to be in motion when they're projected, and the individual pictures are called frames. It goes from 207 to 211. If you look at 207, you can see the line of the splice. The lower half is more dense because of the adhesive. If you look at the bottom half of 211, the top half of 211 is really the top half of 208. The bottom half is the bottom half of 211 only. You can see the splice more clearly. You can also see that they have a kind of tree that would be far out even for Dallas. The trunk here, the top there. Half of the people don't begin until above their belly buttons. I had a reporter inquire of Time magazine, which owned Life, because I knew they wouldn't talk to me. And their explanation is that it was just an accident. That one of their technicians damaged the film when he was making a copy, and instead of just using Mylar like everybody else does and putting the whole thing back together again, he just cut out these frames. That's a very interesting thing, because with this he eliminated frame 210, and frame 210 just happens to be the one at which the Warren Commission says Lee Harvey Oswald could have struck President Kennedy for the first time. Quite a coincidence. Now, there are other frames missing too, but these I could not then reproduce because the Warren Commission did not ask Life magazine to give them all the frames. They began with, as I remember it, frame 163. Another coincidence there, because between 159 and 162 there are two missing frames too. They did give the Warren Commission up to frame 343. But when people, especially in the FBI, took a good look at the last 9 of those frames, they were just as happy not having them printed. So they just made a slight typographical error and made it seem to be 334. It was 343. And as soon as I published it, all of a sudden those other 9 frames appeared in the slide trays in the National Archive. Lots of coincidences. But there's no doubt about it. That film has missing frames in the original.
Okay, along at the end of the frame, this is kind of, some people believe it, some people don't, that there could possibly be a man with a floppy hat and could be a gun, but it's to the point that it's black and white film. It could be leaves, it could be trees. Have you ever?
Yes.
This part of the film?
I guess I better give you a longer explanation to this. The lady is asking about whether or not there is a man in a floppy hat seen in one of the later frames, as I remember, something past 400. There's been a lot of fine work done on the Zapruder film by a very dedicated young optic specialist named Robert Groden. He did that work originally for me and under my direction. We're very good friends. I'm the godfather of his son. He was a very well-intended young man, and his work on the film is of total fidelity. Everything he did, he brought and showed me. He lived near New York, and I lived near Washington. And he spent many weekends with me, first with his wife and then with his wife and son. And I assure you that his photo optics work is absolutely faithful. There's a terrible temptation when you get before an open microphone, and especially when the lights are on you, and you might go coast to coast, to be important, to jazz it up, to convey the ideas you believe, to try and make a point, and a real temptation to be famous. In Grodin's case, the work he did was ruinous to him. It was costly. Nobody paid him. He couldn't make a living. He had lost time from his job, and he lost his job. He made a great sacrifice. But he also got carried away, especially when Dick Gregory and Mark Lane saw the exploitation possibilities in this. And they had him on Good Night America, things like that, on the stump. Grodin, last visit to me, was with what he said was a major discovery, just what this young lady described. Grodin said he could see a man with a floppy hat and all of that. He goes farther than that. He says he can see a rifle, and he showed me a rifle I didn't see. I could imagine that there could be a hat where Grodin says that's not it. But where he says it is it, I just did not see it. What troubles me about this, more than anything I've yet told you, is what I think makes it impossible for that film to reflect what you accurately reflect, Grodin says, as a man there at that point because of the evidence in the film. I'm going to tell you why. I told you that the motion picture consists of a series of individual pictures. There's a preset shutter. It works at 1/30th of a second. The speed is at which the film is propelled is 1/18th of a second. I saw, and Grodin showed me, only one frame that this is supposed to appear in. And I don't know anybody fast enough to appear and disappear in that infinitesimally small span of time. On the other hand, I think it's quite reasonable to believe that not only were there people there, we know that for sure there were people in that area. I think it's not impossible that there was somebody there shooting, but I do not see it in that film.
Okay, my final question is, why can when I saw the Zapruder film, and it was very slowed down, the slowest I've ever seen it done, is that the president reaches for his neck, and the shot that the fatal shot that hits his head, why does the skull fly backwards if the Warren Commission says it came from behind? Why would its skull fly backwards into the air?
The young lady points out that she also saw it in slow motion, and why, when it's so clear in slow motion that the president goes backward, does anybody say that the shot came from the back? And that is clear, because one of the things I asked Grodin to do was to reproduce each frame 10 times. That was an enormous amount of work. And each frame is reproduced faithfully 10 times. That does slow it down. Well, I can only tell you what David Bellin says. He says it's a nerve spasm. That's one hell of a spasm. If you see that, this bullet, even a slow bullet, like the one conjectured, goes at 2,000 feet a second. It carries a wallop. And to move back into that wallop takes an extremely powerful nervous spasm. If you see that film, the violence of the backward motion of that body is one of two things you will never forget. And it's only by accident that you didn't see it tonight. It was planned to show it to you. The other thing is that the head does explode. And I want to tell you that if you have a chance to see that film, you ought to know that as long as you live, you will never forget it. Does that answer your question, Miss? Thank you very much.
Sir, what success have you had personally in interviewing eyewitnesses, policemen, surgeons, nurses, or whatever involving this case? And what success have you had with that?
The gentleman asked, what threats have I had, and did it have any connection with my work? And he ticked off the kind of witnesses I have interviewed. it had no direct connection with my work. The only interference in my life in direct connection with my work, of which I know, the FBI just has not gotten around to addressing after 7 years, and even after I invoked the law to find out. It has been reported to me that when I would go see people, they would go around behind me and ask questions that amounted to a defamation. The Attorney General told Mr. Hoover to respond. Mr. Hoover was too busy spying on Dr. King and things like that. The threats were more often addressed to my wife. When I was away and nobody knew where I was, my wife would get telephone calls. Aren't you afraid for your husband they were away? Aren't you afraid something's going to happen to him? Generally, it was late at night. I've had a couple myself, but I'll tell you one that I think you may enjoy. But about 2:30 in the morning, and this guy calls me, and he engages me in conversation, and all of a sudden he says, I got my favorite movie, and I want you to hear it. And he puts on the soundtrack of Shane. Do any of you remember the classic Western Shane? I see the nod of heads. Okay. I don't know many people. In fact, in 63 years, I've never met anybody who walks around with a soundtrack of Shane and is prepared to pipe it into a telephone line at 2:30 in the morning. However, I was prepared, but for an entirely different reason. I don't pay attention to this kind of stuff. If I did, I wouldn't be here. And I don't think anybody ought to pay attention to it. We all have obligations. I want to remind you of Robert Frost's words that were so popular with President Kennedy. For I have promises to keep and miles to go before I sleep. I think this is the kind of thing that should concern us, meeting our obligations, not being intimidated. I think you should also know that people who intend to hurt you don't advertise it in advance. So I'm prepared to interview witnesses by telephone, and I have a tape recorder not too far from the telephone. So after this guy starts playing the soundtrack of Shane, I wonder what the hell's going on. I taped it, and then I taped his voice afterwards. And I took it to my local police department, and they said that certainly is a threat. And I'm not against police, not at all. We need police. There's another police department with which I had an association, and they were equipped with much more scientific material, and I gave them a tape, and they have sound prints of it. And if that guy calls me again, you know very well what I'm going to do with the tapes, and you know very well what proof will happen. Okay? Next question. Yes.
Do you know what the status is of any House or Senate bill to reopen the investigation?
What is the status of any President House or Senate bill to reopen the investigation? It didn't receive much attention, but the House of Representatives did appoint a special committee which by pre-agreement among both parties and the leadership would not be active until after the election. They have appointed a chief counsel, Richard Sprague, who is one of the country's most outstanding prosecutors. He prosecuted the Oblonsky murder case. You may remember that one. They've selected their assistant counsel, and I've met several of them. One of them is a former Department of Justice organized crime lawyer, and things like that. So, and they are organizing a staff, and they have begun to conduct research.
Do you also believe that advances in technology will play a greater role in the investigation? I'm speaking in particular of, you mentioned voice prints. I heard that like Lee Harvey Oswald, before he was killed, said that he did not kill anyone, and that is, on a recorded statement, there were tape recorders there. And doing voice prints of that, they come up with the conclusion that he was telling the truth.
May I interrupt you?
Sure.
The gentleman's talking about what he's called voice prints, but it really isn't that. It's called a psychological stress evaluator, where an analysis is made of tape recordings of the voice. And he's referring to the allegation that such an analysis of Oswald's voice, when Oswald said, "I didn't kill anybody," shows that, in fact, Oswald did not kill the president. Is there more to your question?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
do you think that will carry any weight, and can they go back to the recordings that they do have and somehow analyze them that way?
Do I think this will carry any weight, and can this be used in going backwards to analyze other things? Well, I have to confess a prejudice. I'm old-fashioned. I don't like the idea of computers replacing the human mind. I think everything's fine in its place, including computers. I don't like this kind of what to me is pseudoscience, where there is a question of interpretation, there are no positives, there are no certainties, and in fact there is great doubt. Let me tell you about another test made by this PSC, Psychological Stress Evaluator. It was a test made on the voice of Dr. Humes. Remember the guy who got cold and burned the president's autopsy to keep himself warm? That Dr. Humes. The guy who said there was no metal in the president's body and then there was? That Dr. Humes. The Dr. Humes who said the president was shot in the back of the head, knowing damn well he was shot in the top of the head? That's the same Dr. Humes. Well, now, according to this former CIA type, he says he's former, George O'Toole, who wrote a book called The Assassination Tapes, he subjected the voice of Dr. Humes to the psychological stress evaluator. And according to George O'Toole and the psychological stress evaluator, Dr. Humes is an honest man. Do we have another question?
Mr. Weisberg, could you describe the physical condition of the rifle that Oswald used supposedly to kill Kennedy?
This is a very good example of the importance of having a question and answer period. The question is, can I describe, not that all the other questions weren't good, but this was an oversight on my part. Can I describe the condition of the alleged fatal rifle with appreciation for being reminded? First of all, the rifle was known as Mussolini's contribution to humanitarian warfare. That's a general statement, but it refers to this rifle. I have one, and you couldn't pay me enough to make me fire it. Others have, but they're braver than I am. CBS conducted some tests, or had tests conducted, with other of this rifle, not this one, and they couldn't have been one in worse condition. Half the time it didn't function. Half or more of the efforts to shoot the rifle in test had to be abandoned because the rifle didn't work. Now, about this specific rifle, it was not made for telescopic sight. It's a bolt-action rifle. This means that after every shot, you have to activate the bolt by throwing it up, pulling it back hard to eject the shell, pushing it forward to insert the next shell and be ready to fire. In order to do this, you got a choice of two things: put your own eye out or moving the rifle away from your eye, because that bolt's going to go in your eye unless you move it. It wasn't equipped for telescopic sight, and when the Army got it at Aberdeen Proving Grounds to test it for the Warren Commission, the sight couldn't be used. They had to put shims under it. There weren't no shims under it in Dallas. When the FBI got it, and they tried to use the telescopic sight, they couldn't adjust it. So finally they decided, well, we'll just let it sit where it is, and by God, this is better, because it shoots high and to the right, and that means if he's a lousy shot, it's going to correct for him because the president was going away. The FBI examined the rifle, and they told the Warren Commission it was very well oiled. Only it had a rusty firing pin. I think that's enough on the rifle. It was a lousy rifle among lousy rifles, and it couldn't be operated as fast as it had to be to fit the official story.
I'd like to know your explanation then. If you don't think that the CIA or the FBI or the Warren Commission had anything to do with it, why did they go to all this trouble to cover this up or to suppress all of it?
I think that the lady intends more by the question. I'll repeat what she said, and then she can tell me if I'm wrong. I think she's really asking who killed the president And if the FBI and the CIA were not involved in it, why did they go all this trouble to cover up? Is that right? Well, first let me tell you, I don't know who killed John Kennedy. Next, let me tell you, if anybody else says he does, lock up your family silver. There was never any investigation. There's nothing in the official files, therefore, to tell you who killed John Kennedy. Now, why did the FBI and CIA cover up all of this? Well, this is a crime J. Edgar Hoover did not solve. He was not about to admit that the president could be killed when we all expected him to keep the president alive, didn't we? Without him doing something about it. So he says he did something about it. But there's more than just that. It was official policy. We now know this because of other suppressed evidence that came to light. And here again we have the value of the questions. I should have thought of this. Nicholas Katzenbach was the Deputy Attorney General of the United States. That meant that in actual practice, he's the guy who ran the department. Immediately, he wrote a memorandum saying that the important thing to do is to see to it that everybody believes there is no conspiracy, that only one man did the killing, that he was Lee Harvey Oswald, and we nabbed him. Really is that simple. In an earlier seminar, I read from a formerly suppressed, again tonight's topic, staff memorandum, and there were several of them that I obtained. This one was written by a staff lawyer named Eisenberg. It turns out that several months after the Warren Commission was appointed, on January 20th, 1964, Justice Warren called the staff together because he was burdened and he wanted to let them know why, when as lawyers they knew he should not have taken the job, he did take the job. There's a previous history of this in the Pearl Harbor investigation, and the criticisms of Justice Jackson for taking that job when he was on the Supreme Court never stopped. There's another reason in this case. Jack Ruby was still alive, and it looked almost certain that his case was going to go to the Supreme Court. Well, why did Justice Warren do it? In his own words, because President Johnson convinced him that if he didn't, 40 million people might be burned up in a nuclear conflagration. Now, where did all that start? All that started with a CIA station in Mexico City, and you people in this archive we're starting here now have the first 105 documents I obtained from the CIA, and that includes what I was just telling you about. This hoked-up tale started in the Mexico City station. More. I was talking earlier today about the deficiencies, which I think is a considerable understatement, of the Schweiker report. They went into a whole razzmatazz about keeping secret in the interest of national security. The name of the man who started this cock and bull story, they identified him by an earlier spook code name of D, like in Dan. Well, his name is Alvarado Ugarte. He was a Nicaraguan spook. They knew that he was lying. They knew that this was a fabrication. The story had self-destruct built in every manufactured detail. But that CIA station in Mexico pumped it hard to Washington, and they scared the hell out of the White House, and they scared the hell out of the State Department. And I'm sure that Justice Warren told the truth when he said that President Johnson told him 40 million people might get killed. And I'm sure that President Johnson believed it, and I was no fan of President Johnson's. Next question.
Is it true that the president's brain was removed during the autopsy and then eventually placed in the archives and has since then disappeared?
The question is it true that the president's brain was removed during the autopsy, has since been placed in the archives, and since then has disappeared? The brain has two parts. They're called hemispheres, left and right. The left hemisphere was removed. What was left of the right hemisphere was removed. It was set in formaldehyde, and after it was set, sections were made. X-rays were taken before and after. I'm going into this explanation because I understand what the gentleman is driving at, and some of you may, and I may anticipate another question. According to these x-rays and according to the Department of Justice reading, which I do believe, because if they were going to lie, I can't imagine them saying that the president was shot 4 inches higher and 6 inches lower. They would have lied all the way. According to the reading of these x-rays, there is no mechanical injury to the bone that encases the left side of the brain that would permit a bullet to go in or out of the brain. You follow me so far? If a bullet fragment or a whole bullet from the right side went in through that big hole in the head and into the left side, it would glow like a fluorescent light in an x-ray. The official Department of Justice panel reading says there is no such thing there. The bony encasement of the bottom of the brain is known as the floor of the fossa, with 2 S's. There are cracks in it, but there is no hole and no means of a bullet or a fragment of bullet going into the left side of the head and going out the bottom. You follow me so far? Now, as to the right side of the head, the examinations were made, but the reports are kept secret except for a paraphrased interpretation of them. Next part of the question has to be with their being transferred to the archives. They were and they were not. And I'm not playing games with you. The government's playing games with us. After, here I'm just stringing facts together. I'm making an interpretation. You don't have to believe it. I'm not stating this as fact. And I hope you understand I've been trying to distinguish between what I believe and the solid fact I've been presenting to you and quoting to you. After my first book was read and rejected by a publisher we have since learned was a CIA publisher, and there was, with some haste, what was called a transfer of the evidence, including some of Dr. Berkeley's papers, out of the possession of the Secret Service. The Secret Service had it all along. I can even tell you whose safe it was in. It was delivered to the National Archives building. It was not delivered to what we generally understand to be the National Archives. It was covered, although the Secret Service did it, it was covered by a letter or a memorandum from Admiral Berkeley, and the exchange appears to have been between Admiral Berkeley personally and Robert Kennedy personally, and neither one of these things is true. It was actually to Evelyn Lincoln, who had been President Kennedy's secretary. She was in a room, as I remember, on the 4th floor of the National Archives. She was not there as Robert Kennedy's representative. She was there as the representative of the Kennedy Library. Now, in case all you budding young scholars don't know it, the Kennedy Library and all presidential libraries are part of the National Archives. But we have an archives and an archivist who are semanticists. And when it suits their convenience, they choose to interpret the National Archives to be limited to the one building in Washington, which is hardly a pinhead compared to some of the other installations. So there was a transfer, and it was to the Kennedy Library, which is part of the National Archives. And it was rigged to appear to be other than it was. I had to sue to get these records, too. I had to use the Freedom of Information law. They only released part of it. And just a month ago, they gave me the rest, and I got them with me. And you folks have copies in the archive that we're duplicating here for you. The third part has to do with disappearance. I have no reason to believe it disappeared. I have no reason to believe it ever appeared. It was not transferred to Evelyn Lincoln. I print the list in postmortem of what was transferred to Evelyn Lincoln. There is no reference to the brain. And remember, Evelyn Lincoln was the National Archive, not Robert Kennedy. Now, there are containers mentioned. One of them in particular was a stainless steel container. I'd not be a bit surprised if it did hold the left hemisphere of the brain. I don't know what's happened to it since it went into the possession of a different part of the federal government. You know, it's like taking a nickel out of your left-hand pocket and putting it in your right-hand pocket. It's the same government. However, what is inherent in this, I'm telling you more about suppression, which is tonight's topic, more about dirty works, more about what we can't possibly accept with an assassination of a president. What is inherent in this can be a snare and a delusion, and don't we have enough folks without looking for them? The suggestion is that if only we could examine that left hemisphere of the brain, all of a sudden, all of this would be solved, all this great suffering that we all feel would be over, the damage to society would be healed, and we could go about our business. And life isn't that way, and the evidence doesn't lead me to encourage you to believe there's any remote possibility of this. That's why I began by explaining what we do know about the left hemisphere of the brain. I think someone walked up for another question.
Could you comment about the fact that there might have been more than one person posing as Oswald?
The question is what I'm going to reformulate. It has to do with was there more than one person posing as Oswald? In my first book, I describe what I call a false Oswald. Subsequent versions are of a second Oswald. There's this difference I want you to understand. False Oswald says what the question says, posing as Oswald, but in a special context that does not exist in the second. A second Oswald means that there really was a first Oswald who was up to something that was duplicated by a second Oswald. Now, there's no reason I know of to believe that Lee Harvey Oswald killed the president. He was being counterfeited, and that's why I call him the false Oswald. There was, without doubt, more than one. But this, without any reasonable question, happened in New Orleans. It happened in Dallas. It certainly happened elsewhere. And when I'm saying it happened, I'm eliminating all these fake reports, especially by the followers of the late Cuban dictator Batista, which had Lee Harvey Oswald every place except on the back of the cow as she jumped over the moon. I'm talking about where there are authentic reports of what could not be Lee Harvey Oswald, but described as Lee Harvey Oswald. The answer to that is yes, and on many occasions. Another question? The question was, were any of the 23 or so doctors at the autopsy called to testify, and what are the consequences? A little bit of confusion in the gentleman's mind. There were about 25 people in the room. They were not all doctors, but certainly most of them were not called to testify, and this again is the kind of a valuable contribution that always comes from a responsive audience, something I overlooked. The chief surgeon, I think he's called, the top medical officer of the Navy was there. You'd never know it from the Warren Commission. It's 26 volumes of printed evidence. It's 300 cubic feet of unprinted and once suppressed evidence. His name is Admiral Kenny. Not long thereafter, he retired. In the performance of the autopsy, there was made what is known as a Y cut. That means you start with the navel and go up to each armpit and lay open all the vital organs. However, when the official story is that a bullet went in the back and came out the front, they never did what was essential to trace the path of that bullet. It's called the track. And again, I was able to have some questions asked in New Orleans, as of Robert Fraser, this time of Lieutenant Colonel Pierre A. Fink. He's since been made a colonel. F-I-N-C-K. For those of you who may be thinking of Rat Fink, I do. And Colonel Fink said no, they did not trace the track of the bullet. And he was asked why, and he was said they were given a direct order by Admiral Kenny not to do it. And he was asked, Does he know why it was done? And he said, well, he believed it was in order not to deface the body. They had laid the whole thing open, but they didn't do the evidentiary need, which obviously didn't happen in any event. There was no bullet in that path from back to front, and that's the explanation of it. But you imagine, I did remember to tell you that they posted a military guard and left no civilians in, no civilian doctor, but I forgot to tell you what the military ordered under military security. And now perhaps if you go back to what I didn't forget to show you, the threat if anybody opened his yap. Thanks to this gentleman, we have a more complete picture. And as somebody said this morning, or was it last night, that scares me. I think you ought to be scared. Another question? Be a good idea if someone has another question, be standing in line. Save some time.
Why has there been this suppression by the FBI and the Warren Commission? I know you answered it before, but more specific.
The gentleman asked for a more specific answer to the question, why has there been this suppression? I might add detail and motive, but I can't add fact. Nobody told me why he suppressed it. There are no affidavits on it. We have yet to get to the point where we can question anybody in court about it, but we look forward to it. And I don't want to conjecture. I can't really materially add. They had to cover up, and they covered up. This is a fact. Another question?
I was wondering about your opinion. You must have some type of opinion.
My opinion is that they covered up to protect the reputations of the federal agencies, especially J. Edgar Hoover, because they hadn't the slightest idea who killed President Kennedy, because they were afraid that a war might start even a week after the assassination, and for some period thereafter. I don't believe for 1 minute that beginning a week after the assassination there was any danger of a war or a revolution. They did it in order to effectuate a more peaceful transition from the Kennedy administration to the Johnson administration. They did it to keep peace and tranquility in the country. They did it to give you some milquetoast because they think you all can't stand bad news. All sorts of reasons like this. I really can't add to them, though. I believe somebody did have another question.
I believe that the 5 fragments came from one bullet, and I heard that the total weight of the 5 fragments were more than the bullet that was
The question has 2 parts. If there's another part, ask it separately. Do I believe all the 5 fragments came from one bullet? And how about the weight of the various fragments compared with bullet 399? Well, I'll give you a specific and a general answer. I believe that the spectrographic analysis that I have not obtained after 10 years of effort proved the truth of the official story. They wouldn't be waiting for me to knock on the door. They would have had it on every front page, on every television tube. I don't think there's any reasonable doubt about that. Why would they suppress it if it proves the truth of it? The process of spectroscopy is 60 years old. It's not a secret process that has to be hidden. About the weight, I'm going to answer another question you didn't ask first because it's very helpful to me again. The weight of a bullet before it is fired varies within a certain narrow range. The manufacture and the weighing is not that precise. A whole cartridge consists of a shell with powder in it and a bullet. And when it is fired, the bullet separates from the shell. The powder in the shell propels the bullet down the barrel of the rifle. There are in the rifle what are known as lands and grooves. You saw the twist on that bullet, I'm sure. This gives it a spiral turn and stability in flight. It also cuts out of the jacket of the bullet, on a bullet of this size, approximately 1/2 grain of weight. The FBI weighed a number of bullets of this manufacture, and they weighed this bullet. I have not yet been able to get them to tell me when they weighed this bullet, but they said that there was a maximum of 2.5 grains difference. Now, that really is very, very little weight. But they didn't bother to tell the Warren Commission that a half grain was lost in firing. This left a maximum of 2 grains. And nobody bothered to calculate the weight of that piece of copper alloy jacket that Fraser took out. And nobody even knew about the piece of lead core that Fraser took out. And what I am telling you is that this amounts to the fact that no metal was lost by bullet 399 during the assassination of John Kennedy. Now, on the weight of the 5 fragments, they were small. The largest, I think, was, roughly about a 1/5 or a 1/6 of the presumed weight of the entire bullet. Another question? Does that answer it?
How much did the fragments that were found in President Kennedy's body and in Governor Connolly's body, how much did those fragments weigh that Commission Exhibit 399 supposedly inflicted, and how does this relate to the official solution?
How much did the fragments in the bodies of Governor Connolly and President Kennedy weigh, and how does this relate to the official solution? What George really means is how much did the recovered fragments weigh? And I've forgotten the exact weight, but it is less than 2.5 grains. However, that's no answer. There was a fragment left in Governor Connolly's thigh that, according to the x-rays, is 3.5 millimeters long. Well, I measured that picture of the bullet base that you saw has a millimeter scale in it, and there's no place from which a fragment any more than 2 millimeters long could have come. There's no way of computing the weight of the fragment left in his leg, so the FBI just left it out. But I've had a number of organic chemists attempt this for me, and the smallest estimate I have gotten is almost half of all the metal that can be missing. There was a fragment removed from Governor Connolly's wrist, very light. But nobody talks about the fragments that were left in Governor Connolly's chest and were not recovered and were, to a degree, but not completely, washed out in surgery. Now, how can I say not completely? Because of the doctor who was in charge of Governor Connolly's care. His name is Dr. Shires. They didn't bother calling Dr. Shires to Washington to testify before the Warren Commission because Dr. Shires told the Warren Commission staff lawyers down in Dallas that he had x-rays taken of Governor Connolly's chest after the surgery, and fragments of metal were left in Governor Connolly's chest. There were fragments of metal left in Governor Connolly's wrist that were washed out when the wound was clean. So you see, George, there's no way of addressing what you have in mind by weighing the fragments they recovered. Another question?
I heard that after the assassination, the car that the president rode in was shipped to Detroit to be rebuilt, and I was wondering why that was and where the car is today.
Very good question with one minor error in it. The gentleman says he heard that after the assassination, the car the president was riding in was shipped to Detroit to rebuild, and what's happened to it today? It was shipped to Cincinnati, to the Eisenstadt Iron Works to be rebuilt, and I'm not sure where it is today, but there was a period of time when it was a backup car. They were in great haste to rebuild this car, and thus all the evidence that was in the car was destroyed and disappeared forever. We have another question?
Where did bullet 399 come from?
The question is, where did bullet 399 come from? Well, when I was a little boy and I asked where I came from, I was told a cabbage head. I don't know where bullet 399 came from. I'm reasonably certain it was fired from the rifle said to be Lee Harvey Oswald's rifle. I'm reasonably certain it was not used in the assassination of John Kennedy, and I am therefore certain, and I think this is really what the gentleman was driving at, I am therefore certain that it was planted to be found in Parkland Hospital. Now, the history of this bullet, quite aside from the evidence I've just referred to and shown you tonight, leaves no other alternative. Governor Conley, first of all, nobody really knows what stretcher it was supposed to have been on. At first it was believed to be President Kennedy's stretcher, but once you had a single bullet theory, which had the bullet winding up in Governor Conley, couldn't have been President Kennedy's stretcher and have that hold water, could it? So, our inspector, who was in charge of this area of the work, was questioning Darrell Tomlinson, a hospital engineer, who was the man responsible for the finding of the bullet. And he tried to get Tomlinson to say, under oath, that this bullet came from Governor Conley's stretcher. He pressured Tomlinson, who is an ordinary, honest American citizen, to the point where Tomlinson told him, if I were to say what you are trying to get me to say, I could not sleep at night. Tomlinson told this story, that the elevators had been sealed off. As a trusted hospital employee, he had been called to operate an elevator that would run up and down in an emergency area for such purposes as to obtain blood. That when he was put on the elevator, he found a stretcher there. It was on the floor on which the governor was operated on. They didn't have to operate on Governor Conley immediately. They tried to tend to President Kennedy first, while new staff members were called to the emergency area. Tomlinson didn't want the stretcher on the elevator, of course, because it was in the way, and it's a rolling stretcher of the kind that's needed in emergencies, and he knew they'd want it in the emergency room entrance. So he took it out, put it in the hallway, and meanwhile he went about his assigned task of operating the elevator. He came down to that floor, which is the level of the emergency room, just in time to see a doctor who had to relieve himself, give it a shove so the doctor could enter the men's room door. When the doctor shoved the rolling stretcher, it hit the wall. And a bullet, .399, we're told, there's not even a chain of possession on that, the evidence was handled so carefully, fell out from underneath the mattress. Underneath, you understand? Now this presented quite a problem to Mr. Spector, who hooked up the single bullet theory, and he questioned the orderly and the nurse who handled that stretcher and who undressed Governor Conley. And the nurse said there was no bullet that was in the clothing and no bullet on the stretcher, and the orderly said that when he removed the stretcher, there was no bullet on the stretcher. So here's what we have, and my name is not grim as in fairy tales. We have this bullet inflicting all of these injuries and then lying, lurking in wait right here, firmly attached to the tibia. That's the thigh bone. So firmly attached that a piece of it is still there. That's how I know the size on the x-rays, 3.5 millimeters. It's a sneaky bullet. And it had very fine intelligence. Governor Conley tried to get up and get out of the car. He was semi-conscious. He passed out for a while. He tried to get out of the car so they could get to President Kennedy because he was in the jump seat. He fell. He staggered. They had to remove him by lifting him. It took a lot of force, a lot of motion, getting him out of a car in a jump seat, cramped quarters. But that bullet was lurking and waiting. Its time had not come. They put Governor Conley on a stretcher, and they rolled him into the emergency. They took a look at him, and that bullet was laying back. They took him on the elevator, and the bullet was just developing its sense of timing to even greater perfection. It wasn't going to let any nurse see it naked. It wasn't going to let any orderly desecrate it by handling it. When nobody was looking, this bullet buried deep inside the entrance point, not deep in the flesh, but several inches away from the entrance point, knew just the moment it would not be seen. And then it generated something that I think you will never be taught in your own science classes. What I think, because it doesn't exist, we have to give a name to, everything has to have a nomenclature, let's call it reverse kinetic energy. It knew just how much to use, just how much English to put on that twist, to execute an arc and come to rest after having skillfully avoided the metal edge of the stretcher and yet not cut the mattress. It knew just how much force to use so it wouldn't get lost underneath the mattress, just how little force to use so that it could emerge into history when the doctor had to urinate. Does that answer your question? Almost. Let's try again.
Okay. You said that the bullet, you thought...
Excuse me. I do this on purpose. I don't want you to make light of it. I want you to see how totally ridiculous the official solution of the murder of our president and the nullification of the whole system of society is, sanctified by the most eminent men in the country, insisted upon now by every agency of government involved, and I do feel a sense of outrage about it. But this gets grim, it gets hard to live with, and I'm trying to make a point, and the point is, this is so ridiculous, and yet they insist on it. Excuse me.
The bullet did come from Oswald's rifle, right?
The bullet did come from Oswald's rifle, right. Well, let me change that just a little bit. The bullet came from the rifle that was found on the 6th floor depository building. The rifle was traced to Lee Harvey Oswald by a mail order, and then only by handwriting experts. It may very well have been Lee Harvey Oswald's rifle, but nobody ever put it in his possession. The law requires that when a rifle is be shipped by mail, there be a receipt for it. Nobody produced the receipt. And you know what pulp magazine paper is. I am not all that persuaded that you can make a precise handwriting analysis from a copy made from a microfilm of an inked signature on pulp paper. But let's assume it was Oswald's rifle.
You can trace the bullet to a certain rifle by the lands and grooves are particular to rifle, plus the powder, et cetera, et cetera.
Yes, the gentleman says that it is possible to trace a rifle to a particular bullet, not by the lands and grooves, but by the striations imparted in those lands and grooves by the imperfections of the barrel.
Okay, now, if the bullet was planted, somebody had to, at some time prior to this, fire it into something. What, first of all, what could you
If the bullet was planted, somebody had to have some knowledge in advance. Agreed.
Okay. It was fired into something so that it wasn't distorted.
It was fired into something so that it wasn't distorted. Let me interrupt to say I don't think it was cotton. A cotton tube is normally used for this, because if that had happened, some cotton might have remained on the bullet. I think it was fired into a tank of water, but the person who fired it didn't tell me.
That's the question. Now, could you take a spectrographic analysis of the tip of the bullet to find out what material it was fired into?
The question is, could a spectrographic analysis show what it was fired into? Well, until I can get the spectrographic analysis of what I'm really interested in, I can't answer. I would doubt it, but I think the spectrographic analysis will destroy the whole story, so we won't have to bother to do that. Thank you. Another question? There's a picture of bullet 399. The bottom part is flattened. That's good. Hold it there if you can. If you look all the way at the top on the right, you'll see a little indentation. That's where Mr. Fraser removed the copper specimen. But look how that bullet shines. Look how perfectly smooth the scorings of the rifle barrel are. There is not even a hairline scratch on that bullet. Go to the next one, George. This is out of order. That's the base of the bullet. And if the lighting situation did not prevent it, and you can see it, if the lighting, I mean, you will be able to see it, all of you who live here, you can see And I hope that the shadows even permit you to see that there are sharp lines there. That metal missing and shown by shadow is what Fraser cut out. Now, there is a ring around the bullet that you may see. That's the copper jacketing, copper alloy jacketing. And all inside of that ring is the lead alloy core. As you can see, that bullet is almost perfect in that dimension. It's just slightly flattened toward the bottom and a little bit above the bottom toward the nose. Try the next one, George. Down a little bit. That's good. These are pictures that the archives took for me when I finally got them to do it. That's a millimeter scale at the bottom, and you can see it's a very small bullet. But if you look at the reflection of the light, Jim, would you mind coming up and pointing these things out for me, please, while I'm talking? If you look, hold it, George, don't go too high. What they did is high enough. You can see the shadowing and the light, the reflection of the light, which shows you a smooth, relatively smooth edge. You can see the cut. We'll go on to the next one, and then we'll put Jim to work. That is another view of the same thing, and again, you can't see it with this kind of light, but Jim, would you mind outlining where you know the cut to be, especially where the edge is smoother, or haven't your eyes adjusted? I'm tied up with the harness. Go to the pale section, that's it, come right down there. Now come on down lower, where it's, now that's it, go right along that line. That's it. Now the next one, please. That's good. Jim, do you think you can point out where the president's shirt was cut? Can you see it clearly enough down on the body of the shirt? That's the idea. That jagged line is not shadow. It's a perfectly normal and proper thing. There was a real emergency when the president got to the hospital, and his clothing was literally and properly and of necessity cut off. But you won't find that in the Warren report because they only had 900 pages. Go to the next one. That shows, find? That shows the pattern of the blood. You're looking at the shirt to the back. Now, this may not mean anything, but it certainly is not addressed in the evidence. And it should have been addressed in the evidence, and I want to explain why. The story is that all the president's wounds were on the right side of the back of his body. But look at that, and almost all the blood is on the left, coming lowest in the midline. No investigation, no explanation, the question lingers. Please go to the next one, George. Is that the next one? If it is, it's a duplicate of the same picture, and go to the next one. Oh my, that's a tragedy. We can't see that one. And that is a very important picture. George, hold it right there. Well, let's not waste any time with it, George. You won't make it out. Go to the next one. Now, Jim, would you show, this is the president's necktie, and Jim is going to point out to you that it was cut off. Now show the V-shaped cut, Jim, on the part away from the knot. Now show that little light spot at the top of the knot where they say it was nicked. That's it. That was done by a scalpel, not by a bullet. You're going to see more on that. They lied to us. Next one, please. You can't see this too clearly, so I'll restrict myself when, that's it right there, George. You see the arrow on the left? You saw how the tie really was, didn't you? Now, Jim, would you mind showing him how the FBI twisted the tie to make it seem like the hole was in the front? The left hand, all the way in the left. Okay. Yeah. No, down lower, follow the arrow. That's it. That shaded, that pale area there is where the scalpel damaged the tie. When the FBI took a picture for the Warren Commission, I told you about this 5-volume report. This is Exhibit 60 in a 5-volume report. They actually twisted the tie around to make it look like the hole was in the middle. Next one, please, George. Just a little bit up, not much. You got it centered good enough. Oh, that's fine. This isn't too clear, but you can see the button on the left, right? You notice that the pattern fits. Now, the president wore very fancy shirts. This was hand-tailored for him by Charles. And you see the buttonhole And you see they're exactly in a line. Now the story is that the bullet came out through the collar, right? Jim, would you please show the good people the top of the damage on that side, a little bit higher? That's it. That's it. Now would you show them the highest point on the other side? It is below the collar band. You see that? That's an enormous difference when you're talking about a 1/4 of an inch bullet and a tied and a button collar, isn't it? There's no hole there. That's a cut. And it was cut by the nurse's scalpel. There were 2 nurses. They were working under Charles Carrico, and I found this out from Dr. Charles Carrico personally. The president's tie was cut off. It had to be. And when they cut the tie off, they couldn't avoid cutting through the shirt collar. And this was turned around by the government, executive branch, and presidential commission, and we were told that the bullet came out there. Now, bad as the lighting conditions are here, you can see that that's no bullet hole. That's a slit. It's a cut. Okay, next one, please. Oh, my. This is all out of order, but I'll tell you what it is. Jim, can you see that pale part there? Go around that. This is a picture of the curbstone. And I'm sorry that when these were dropped, they weren't put back in order, because it would make much more sense to you. But you can see a difference in light and dark there, can't you? That light spot in this picture, which I recognize as that taken by a TV cameraman named Underwood, at the time of the crime, where James Tegg was hit, shows that there is a mechanical damage to the curb. The next one, please. Go ahead when you can, George. This, you see where the pencil is, the arrow is? See the dark spot there? This is a news picture taken at the same time as Dillard by a newspaper photographer named Tom Dillard, and there certainly is not only a mechanical injury to the curb, but there's an arrow pointing to it and a pencil pointing to it. Next one, George, please. Now, can you hold it? This, please take my word for it, the top would tell you, you can see laboratory worksheet. This is a Xerox given to me under order of the court of an FBI laboratory worksheet on this curbstone. And if you don't mind raising it a little bit, you will see that it says, small foreign smears, see attached for location, were run spectrographically, Jarrell ash, that's the name of the test, and found to be essentially lead with a trace of antimony, could be bullet metal, no copper observed. Now, this, we have been assured under oath, is the total FBI record of the total scientific examination of a bullet with 12 component parts. 2, lead and antimony. 1, what is on the outside. Remember, it's a copper-jacketed bullet, and you saw the shine of the copper. No copper when it hit the curb. Isn't that some kind of magic now? Next, please. There you have a diagram. Hold it, that's fine. There you have a diagram of made in the FBI laboratory when they dug that curbstone up and flew it to Washington. You will see the measurements at the top show that this 1/4 inch bullet made what they call a smear, 1 3/4 inches high and 1 inch wide, and we're just beginning to get into the real magic, folks, because the bottom is even more magical. This is oriented so that on your right is the west, on your left is the east. You will look and you will see it says a 33-degree angle downward. Now let me explain to you that between 400 and 500 feet away, 66 feet in the air, according to your presidential commission and mine, there was Lee Harvey Oswald shooting from the east at the president and firing the shot that hit James T. Tegg. This shows it coming from the west. Now, if you were to follow back at 33 degrees, beginning approximately 22 feet away, you would find that there is even greater magic. A rifle and a rifleman buried in solid concrete so thick it could carry the heaviest load of freight cars on tracks, 12 tracks wide, so many that they had to make 3 parallel bridges to carry the weight. Next one, please. Now, you can't see this, I'm sorry to say, because of the darkness. Try the next one, and maybe it's in the same sequence. Can you see anything, Jim? Can you point it out? I can't see it. Let me tell you what this is. As you can see, what the official story would disgrace an 8-year-old kid's intelligence. But I wanted to develop proof. Something happened to the sound. Do I have it back? Okay, Jim, you better stay off the wire. I was just getting over pneumonia when this picture was taken, and Jim was with me, so I didn't know if he'd remember it. I wanted new proof. I wanted a picture of the curbstone as it exists in the National Archives today. It's been patched, folks. They don't want any damaged evidence when a president gets killed. So they got a mix of concrete, and they were very careful. They weren't chinchy. They used less coarse aggregate and more fine aggregate. This befits the head of a state. And they got a nice smooth patch out of finer concrete so you can see the difference in the question and answer period. Because my purpose in being here is to try and inform you this is the way our society functions when it functions as it should. It functions with the people knowing and the people then expressing their will to their elected representatives. When I was thinking of what I was going to say, a phrase I've heard and you've heard very often came to mind. I'm not going to expand on it, but I want to remind you that we all know that lest the Lord guard the city, the watchman waketh in vain. The city here is our officialdom. Honesty in officials, the Lord is, and the city is our system of society. I've only told you part, an important part, but only part, and not that part by any means completely, about what happened when the government decided not to investigate the killing of our president, which of course means the upsetting of all of our system of society, the nullification of the entire electoral process, and the absolute negating of any concept of representative society. I can't think of anything more subversive in a country like ours than the nullification of all of democratic society, all of a representative system. And I think you should ask yourselves, as I have in the very first, asked myself, when this can happen to any president, whether or not you like John Kennedy, any president, is any president ever free? Can any president ever dare make a decision he thinks may be unpopular among people of power? And if he can't, what has happened to our system of society? If this is the case with the president, is any one of us really free? Really? Well, we can walk around, we can say what we want, but things happen. And does not this represent a jeopardy to everyone, not just our system of society? I was also thinking that there's so many great Americans who have done and said so many wonderful things. And I thought of one that I wanted to quote exactly to you, and I've typed it up so I can read it verbatim. It is a statement by one of the most respected justices of our Supreme Court, Justice Louis Brandeis. Most of you are too old to remember him unless you've studied him. I remember him, and he was a truly great man, one of the outstanding jurists in all of the history of the world. This is what he once said: "Decency, security, and liberty alike demand that government officials shall be subjected to the same rules of conduct that are commands to citizens. In the government of laws, existence of the government will be imperiled if it fails to observe the law scrupulously. Our government is the potent, the omnipresent teacher. For good or ill, it teaches the whole people by its example. Well, we've had one example tonight, a partial example of how our government seeks to teach. I think it now behooves us, in whatever way any one of us may think he or she can, to undertake to teach the government. Because I hope you will agree with me that this we just cannot have. I thank you very much.